The training ground was a wide, open place filled with dust and heavy air, the kind that made every sound sharper and every movement louder. In the middle were cages, tall and strong, yet always shaking as predator cubs pushed against the bars. These cubs were not like the gentle animals some might picture when thinking of young creatures. Even as younglings, they carried the sharpness of hunters in their eyes. Their claws scraped the ground, their growls rolled like thunder, and their movements were fast and fierce. The aliens who watched them from outside the cages saw not children of beasts, but storms waiting to break free. To the rulers, these cubs were meant to be weapons, sharpened from birth and forced to obey commands, but nothing about them ever hinted at obedience. Trainers came every day with their methods, each more severe than the last. Some carried chains that clinked loudly as they walked, believing the cold weight of iron could force strength into submission. They would wrap the cubs' necks or paws, trying to hold them down, but the chains always rattled with resistance. The cubs bit at the metal, pulled until their muscles trembled, and when they couldn't break free, they snarled with such fury that the ground itself seemed to shake. The aliens thought fear would grow in their eyes after such struggles, but instead, the cubs only grew wilder. Their eyes glowed brighter, their cries louder, as though every attempt to bind them only fed their defiance. Others tried their voices, filling the grounds with sharp orders shouted in alien tongues. They barked commands like whips in the air, expecting the cubs to flinch and follow. But the cubs did not bow their heads. They did not bend. They stood their ground, their ears twitching only with irritation, and when the shouting grew too loud, they leapt, slashing at the air, sometimes even at the bars of their cages. The aliens were startled, stepping back as if realizing that the sound of their voices meant nothing in the hearts of these creatures. What was a command to those who had never known masters? To the cubs, noise was only noise, never a reason to submit. Some trainers thought fear was the strongest leash. They came with tools to spark pain, long rods that crackled with energy, whips that sliced through air with sharp sounds. They thought if the cubs feared hurt, they would obey to escape it. Yet each time the tools struck, the cubs only grew louder, their roars echoing far beyond the camp, their growls mixed with sparks, their eyes burning with rage. One cub even lunged so hard against the bars that the cage tipped forward, crashing against the ground with a force that made the trainers stumble back. It was then clear that pain only fed their storms. Instead of breaking them, cruelty built their fire. Days turned into weeks, and the alien trainers grew tired. Every method was failing. Chains could not bind them. Orders could not guide them. Fear could not break them. The cubs were storms, wild, restless, untamed. They struck against every boundary set before them, never learning the silence of submission. The aliens whispered among themselves, shaking their heads with disbelief. They had trained countless creatures before, beasts of many kinds across the stars. But none had been like this. None had been so unwilling to bend. In the evenings, when the suns lowered and shadows stretched across the camp, the rulers would gather to watch from a distance. Their robes shimmered faintly in the fading light, their faces stern, eyes narrowed with disapproval. They spoke quietly, their voices low but filled with certainty. They told one another that these creatures could not be tamed, that their nature was too wild, their blood too fierce. They believed no being in the universe, not even the greatest trainers among them, could ever calm such storms. To them, the cubs were failures, not because they lacked strength, but because they refused control. And in their eyes, anything that could not be controlled was dangerous. Yet even in this belief, the cubs did not weaken. In fact, their resistance seemed to grow with every failed attempt. They grew stronger, sharper, more united. When one resisted, the others growled in rhythm as though backing each other in defiance. Their bond was not of obedience to their trainers, but to one another. They moved like a tide, flowing in the same direction, standing together against every attempt to break them. The more the aliens tried to control, the more the cubs proved that storms cannot be leashed. The camp itself bore the marks of their struggle. Cages bent out of shape, bars dented by powerful strikes, ground clawed with deep grooves. Trainers carried scratches on their arms, fear in their eyes, and stories of the cubs' refusal on their tongues. And though they returned each day with new methods, their confidence was fading. Whispers grew louder among them. Perhaps these cubs were not meant to be trained at all. Perhaps they were only meant for chaos. But still, the rulers held on to one belief. If they could not tame the cubs, then surely no one else could. They convinced themselves that this was not their failure but the truth of the creature's nature. They stood taller when they said it, their voices firm as though making a declaration to the universe. No being, they declared, no mind, no hand, no voice could ever calm them. They are storms. They are wild, and wild they will remain. Those words settled over the camp like heavy chains of their own, shaping the way every alien saw the cubs. The trainers repeated them. The guards whispered them. Even the children of the camp grew up hearing them as warnings, that some things were too fierce to be touched, too wild to be approached. The cubs were not seen as creatures anymore, but as warnings themselves, reminders that not all storms could be weathered. Yet, in the silence of night, when the stars scattered across the sky and the cubs finally rested from their endless defiance, there was a strange stillness. In those moments, their breathing slowed, their bodies curled close together, and their growls faded into soft rumblings of sleep. To anyone who dared to watch without fear, they almost looked peaceful, not storms, not monsters, but living beings simply guarding one another in the dark. But no alien trainer allowed themselves to see that side. They had already decided the truth, and they carried it like armor. The cubs could never be tamed, and no being in all the stars would ever prove otherwise. The camp had grown used to failure. Each day brought the same sight. Alien trainers walking into the enclosure with tools of control, only to leave with scratched arms, dented pride, and the same bitter truth on their tongues. The predator. Cubs could not be tamed. The cubs were storms in small bodies, restless and defiant, never bowing to force, never silenced by fear. The aliens told themselves no living being could calm such creatures, and their words became a chant repeated through the stronghold. But then, one morning, everything changed. A single human was led into the camp, her steps soft and her face unmarked by the heavy pride the others wore. She was not dressed in armor, nor did she carry tools or chains. She looked ordinary, even fragile, compared to the towering aliens and the wild cubs, yet her presence carried something that could not be explained by size or strength. The aliens laughed when they saw her. Their voices filled the air with cruel amusement, confident this experiment would end in failure. To them, humans were small, weak, soft creatures, unfit for storms like the cubs. They whispered to one another that this would end quickly, that the cubs would test their claws and teeth on her just as they had against the trainer's chains. Their laughter was sharp, like stones striking metal, echoing across the training grounds as if mocking the very idea of her being there. The cages opened, and the cubs came forward. Their paws patted heavily on the dirt, their movements sharp, with energy. They circled the space, their bodies low, their eyes glowing with restless fire. Growls rolled from their throats like warnings carried by the wind. The crowd leaned closer, waiting for the moment chaos would break loose. Every alien expected her to scream, to run, to raise her arms in fear. They had seen it before. They had lived it themselves. To them it was not a question of what would happen, only when. But the human did not do what they expected. She did not grab a weapon, for she carried none. She did not shout commands, for her voice was calm and steady. She did not run, though every instinct must have told her to flee. Instead, she stood quietly, her feet planted firmly in the dirt, her hands resting at her sides. And then she did something no one understood. She smiled. It was not a smile of arrogance, not one that mocked or challenged. It was gentle, simple, soft, the kind of smile that spoke of patience and warmth. It was the kind of smile given to a frightened child or a lost animal, the kind that said, "I see you. I am not here to harm you." To the aliens, it was foolishness. They muttered that she was wasting her final moments, that no smile could silence storms. But to the cubs, the smile was not noise, it was not chains. It was something they had never been shown before, calmness without threat. The cubs hesitated. Their growls faltered, their steps slowed, and though they still circled her, their eyes shifted, uncertain. The onlookers grew restless, their laughter dimming into silence. They waited for the attack, but the moment did not come. Instead, the enclosure grew quiet, filled only with the sound of paws brushing the earth and the steady rhythm of her breathing. She did not move too quickly, nor too slowly. She stood as if she belonged, as if she had no reason to fear what others had called monsters. The smallest cub stopped first, pausing mid-step to tilt its head. It looked at her as if puzzled, as though it could not understand why she did not flinch. The others noticed too, their pace slowing until their circle became less sharp, more like a hesitant dance than a hunt. The human's smile never wavered. Her calmness became a mirror in which the cubs saw no enemy, no challenge. Instead of feeding their fire, it quieted it. The crowd grew uneasy. The aliens shifted on their feet, muttering to one another. This was not how the scene was supposed to unfold. They had expected quick chaos, a storm of claws and teeth, proof that humans were weak. Instead, the storm hung in the air, waiting, suspended by something they could not see or touch. The human, with nothing more than a steady heart and a soft smile, had turned their cruel spectacle into a strange stillness. Time stretched in the enclosure. Moments that should have been filled with screams were instead filled with silence. The cubs continued to circle, but their growls softened, their eyes no longer burning with rage but flickering with confusion. The human shifted slightly, not with panic, but with ease, lowering herself so she no longer towered above them. She made herself smaller, not weaker, but more approachable, her smile still resting gently on her face. It was an unspoken gesture, a wordless message. "I am not here to fight you." The aliens could not understand. They whispered that she must be hiding some trick, that perhaps she carried some hidden tool, some secret charm. But there was nothing in her hands, nothing on her body but the clothes she wore. The only thing she carried into the enclosure was her presence, and somehow it was enough to hold the cubs back. One by one, the cubs began to shift their stance, their tails, once stiff and twitching, lowered toward the ground. Their ears, pinned back in aggression, tilted forward with curiosity, their breaths slowed, losing the sharp edge of fury. Still, they did not approach, not yet, but their storm was softening, turning from a roar into a hum. The crowd, once filled with laughter, now stood in silence, their eyes wide as if watching something impossible take shape before them. The human, for her part, did not rush the moment. She did not try to force connection or demand trust. She allowed the silence to grow, allowed the cubs to decide their pace. Her patience was steady, unshaken by the waiting eyes around her. It was as if she understood something the aliens did. Not that storms are not silenced by force, but by calm skies. When the first cub finally stopped circling and simply sat, the air itself seemed to change. The others hesitated, then mirrored the action, lowering themselves slightly, their bodies less tense. The human remained still, her smile soft, her breathing steady. She had not touched them, had not spoken a word, yet the cubs were shifting. In a way no chain, no whip, no shouted order had ever managed. From the watching crowd, disbelief rippled like a wave. The aliens exchanged nervous glances, some shaking their heads, others narrowing their eyes as if unwilling to accept what they saw. But the truth was unfolding before them, undeniable. The cubs had not torn her apart. They had not lunged at her throat or tested their claws on her skin. Instead, they had slowed, settled, and for the first time shown something close to peace in the presence of another being. The rulers who stood above the rest said nothing, their faces unreadable. But even they could not deny the strangeness of what they saw. Their trap, designed to humiliate, was slipping from their grasp. Something they had never believed possible was happening in front of them, and it was happening not through chains, commands, or fear, but through a human's smile. And though the crowd tried to tell themselves this was only a pause, only a moment before the storm, deep inside, they knew something had shifted. The cubs had seen something in her that they had never seen before, and for reasons they could not yet understand, they chose not to fight it. They chose to wait. They chose to breathe. At first, the scene looked like every other cruel display the aliens had arranged before. The cubs circled the human with sharp growls rumbling from their throats, their eyes glowing with untamed fire, their movements quick and threatening. Dust lifted beneath their paws as they scraped the ground, testing the air, testing her. From the crowd of onlookers, whispers rippled like waves, each voice certain of what would happen. They waited for her to fall, to panic, to scream. But the human did not falter. She stood with her feet steady, her breathing calm, her face carrying nothing but quiet focus. There was no fear in her eyes, only something deeper, something the cubs had never seen before. The first shift came slowly, almost invisible at first. One of the cubs, larger than the rest, slowed its pace and stared directly at her face. It was expecting a flinch, a movement that would prove she was prey, but no such thing came. Her calm expression remained, steady as the earth beneath them. The cub tilted its head, puzzled, and growled again, but softer this time, as if the sound lacked conviction. The human didn't react with fear or anger. She simply watched, her lips curved into a faint, gentle smile. Another cub, younger and smaller, copied the pause. It stepped sideways, its eyes still sharp, but less certain, its growl breaking into silence. The crowd gasped at the hesitation. This wasn't how the predators behaved. They were supposed to strike without pause, without thought. Yet now, two of them stood frozen, caught not by chains or commands, but by the simple, unshaken stillness of one fragile human. The human made no sudden move. She didn't step toward them, nor did she reach out her hand. She understood the moment was fragile, like thin glass that could shatter at the smallest force. So she stayed as she was, her arms relaxed, her body unthreatening, her face holding that same smile. It wasn't a smile of victory, but of peace, of kindness. It said, without words, "I am not here to hurt you." The cubs sensed it. Their growls grew shorter, their pacing less sharp. They circled more slowly now, glancing not at her body as prey, but at her face, her eyes, her calm presence. Something inside them wavered, something that had always driven them to attack without thought. They hesitated, and in that hesitation, the entire atmosphere began to change. The crowd shifted uneasily, their whispers louder now, their confidence breaking. They had seen the cubs tear into stronger opponents, rip chains apart, defy trainers with violence. Yet here they were, unsettled by nothing more than a human's silence and a smile. The aliens muttered to each other, searching for explanations. Some said it was luck. Others said the cubs were tired. A few whispered fears they dared not voice, that something greater was at work, something beyond chains and commands. As the minutes stretched, the cubs' aggression faded further. One lowered its stance, its paws pressing into the dirt as it crouched, not in preparation for a strike, but in a posture of rest. Another yawned, the sharpness of its teeth still visible, but the sound carried no threat. The human's calm was becoming their calm, her stillness shaping their movements as though she had cast an invisible circle of peace around them. She did not gloat, did not glance at the crowd as if to claim victory. Her eyes never left the cubs, her attention fully theirs. She understood the power of the moment, that trust was not something to demand, but something to earn slowly, like coaxing a frightened bird to settle. So she remained patient, letting the silence deepen, letting her smile speak louder than any command. For the first time since the cubs had been raised as weapons, their aggression slipped away. They were not snarling, not lunging, not testing their claws on flesh or chains. They were watching her, curious, puzzled, hesitant. Their storm was quieting, as if her peace had seeped into their restless bones. The smallest among them, after several long breaths, sat down completely, its tail curling around its paws. The sight stunned the crowd into silence. The other cubs looked at it, then at her, and one by one they followed, their growls replaced by steady, calm breathing. The aliens could not believe what they were witnessing. They had tried everything: force, fear, hunger, chains, and none of it had worked. Yet this human, with no weapons, no strength, no tricks, had achieved what they could not. She had not broken the cubs into submission. She had not bent their wills. Instead, she had shown them something they had never known: peace without condition. And in that peace, their wildness had softened, if only for a moment. The rulers who stood at the highest platform leaned forward, their eyes narrow, but unblinking. They had expected blood and proof of weakness. What they saw instead was something that challenged everything they believed about control, about power, about the nature of beasts and humans alike. They could not explain it, yet they could not deny it. The human, still smiling gently, finally lowered herself slightly, bending her knees to the ground. She made herself smaller, less towering, more equal to the cubs. It was a gesture of trust. She would not threaten them from above, but meet them where they were. The cubs did not attack. Instead, they leaned closer, their sharp eyes softening, their bodies less tense. One stretched its neck forward, sniffing the air between them, and though the crowd held its breath in fear of the strike, none came. The cub only blinked, as if uncertain, then settled once more. In that single moment, everything shifted. The trap designed to humiliate had cracked open into something else entirely. The cubs, meant to show her weakness, had revealed instead their own capacity for change. They had chosen without force or fear to pause, to hesitate, to let go of violence. The crowd could not look away. Even those who mocked her before now stood in silence, their disbelief painted across their faces. What they saw was not weakness but strength, not the strength of muscle or weapons, but the strength of patience, of quietness, of trust. The cubs remained near her, their bodies relaxed, their breathing calm. The human stayed just as she had been from the beginning, steady, still, smiling softly. She had not broken them, nor had they broken her. Something else had been born instead, a fragile bond, invisible yet undeniable. By the time the moment stretched into an hour, even the most doubtful among the watchers knew this was no accident. This was change, quiet but powerful, written in the stillness between human and predator. And though the rulers said nothing, though the aliens tried to swallow their disbelief, everyone present knew they had witnessed something that would not be forgotten. Each morning, the camp echoed with the sounds of restless cubs. They clawed at the dirt, snapped at each other, and growled at the shadows of their own kind. The alien trainers watched from a distance, frustrated and impatient, whispering doubts. about whether the humans' strange method meant anything at all. To them, control had always meant domination, forcing obedience through fear, punishment, and strength. The cubs had never yielded to such tactics, yet now they were being left in the care of a fragile human who carried no whip, no chain, and no weapon. And yet, every day, the human returned. She stepped into the enclosure without hesitation. Without armor or guard, the aliens leaned forward, expecting each time that her luck would run out, that the cubs would turn wild again, that the story would end in violence. But it never did. She greeted the cubs the same way each time, with a calm face and that gentle smile. She did not rush forward to claim space or shout to demand attention. She simply stood where they could see her, patient and steady, as if she had all the time in the world. At first, the cubs circled her as they always had, their growls a reminder of what they had been bred to be. But the longer she stood, the quieter the storm inside them became. The cubs began to notice something unusual. Unlike the trainers before, the human gave them no reason to resist. She did not lash out when they snarled. She did not flinch when they tested her with sudden movements. She did not pull at their necks with chains or force them to obey shouted orders. Instead, she let silence do the work. And in that silence, they began to feel a new kind of calm, something unfamiliar yet strangely comforting. On the third day, the smallest cub crept closer. The crowd tensed, certain it was preparing to attack, but instead it stopped at her side and sat down, its breathing heavy but steady. The human glanced at it, her expression unchanged, her smile soft. She reached no hand to touch it, made no move to claim control. She let it sit, as if its choice was enough. Slowly, the others followed. First one, then another, until the entire group rested in a loose circle around her. The aliens whispered furiously, their voices full of disbelief. This was not obedience as they knew it. It was not fear. It was choice. Day after day, the bond grew stronger. The cubs no longer growled at her approach. Instead, they lifted their heads, their eyes bright with recognition. Some began to sit before she even entered, as though waiting. They watched her closely, not as prey or enemy, but as something entirely new. They mirrored her calmness, their wild energy softening in her presence. The human never asked for tricks, never pushed them into displays of strength. She did not treat them as tools or weapons. She treated them as beings worthy of patience, and that patience began to reshape them. One afternoon, when the sun hung low and shadows stretched across the camp, the largest cub tested the moment. It rose, padded over to her, and stood tall, its body towering over hers. The crowd held its breath. A single swipe of its claws would end her life, but the cub only leaned forward, its sharp nose inches from her face. The human smiled, calm as ever, and slowly sat down on the ground. She made herself small, no longer towering over them, but choosing to share their space. The cub sniffed once, more, then lowered itself beside her, pressing its weight against her side. The silence that followed was unlike any before. Even the most doubtful aliens felt the change. This was no accident. This was trust. By the seventh day, the cubs no longer needed to test her. They greeted her with low rumbles that were not growls, but something gentler. Sounds of acknowledgement, even acceptance. They followed her movements with ease, not out of fear of punishment, but because they wanted to. When she sat, they sat. When she rose, they rose. It was not command, but connection. The human never broke her pattern. Every day, the same calm smile, the same steady presence. It was simple, but it carried more power than the aliens could understand. Weapons had failed. Chains had failed. Fear had failed. But her smile, a gesture so small, so effortless, reached a place none of those had touched. The rulers who, observed from their high seats, grew restless. This was not what they had planned. The cubs were meant to be monsters, untamable creatures of war, proof that only cruelty could control strength. Yet here they were, choosing to obey not their alien masters, but a single human with nothing more than patience and kindness. The aliens argued amongst themselves. Some claimed she had used tricks, perhaps hidden scents or strange signals. Others accused her of weakness, insisting the cubs were merely tired of resisting. But as the days stretched into weeks, the truth grew harder to deny. This was not weakness. This was transformation. The cubs no longer looked like wild storms contained in a cage. They looked like companions, their sharp eyes softer, their movements calmer. They walked at her side willingly, sat near her willingly, and rested peacefully when she was near. She had given them no orders, yet they had found order in her presence. The most astonishing moment came when a group of alien trainers entered the enclosure, trying once again to reassert dominance. They cracked their whips, barked harsh commands, and shouted in frustration. But the cubs did not respond. They only glanced at the humans, then returned their gaze to her. When she smiled, they settled again, ignoring the trainers completely. The aliens had lost their power. She had gained something far greater, trust freely given. The crowd could no longer deny what they were seeing. The cubs had chosen her. And with that choice, the legend of her smile began to spread. In a world where fear had always been the tool of control, a single human had shown a different path. Day after day, without chains or commands, she built something no one thought possible. The cubs were no longer weapons. They were no longer storms waiting to break. They were companions, bound not by force but by the bond of trust. And it had all begun with nothing more than patience, silence, and a smile. The day the rulers returned to witness the final test, the air in the camp felt heavy. The aliens who had trained and failed to tame the predator cubs gathered in silence, waiting to see the truth for themselves. They remembered all the chains that had been broken, all the commands that had been ignored, all the trainers who had walked away defeated. These cubs had been a symbol of wildness, of storms no one could contain. To see them bow to a fragile human seemed impossible. But when the gates opened, the impossible stood before them. The cubs did not leap with snarls or circle in restless rage. Instead, they sat quietly in a loose circle, their sharp eyes calm, their bodies relaxed. In the middle sat the human, her presence steady, her face carrying the same gentle smile that had carried her through every test. The cubs leaned toward her as though drawn by a quiet gravity, their loyalty clear without a single command. For a long moment, the rulers could not speak. This was not the scene they had expected. They had prepared for blood, for chaos, for the proof of human weakness. Instead, they found peace. The story spread quickly, carried from the camp to nearby cities, from world to world. Whispers told of a single human who had done what no alien had ever achieved. She had not broken the cubs' spirits with chains, or forced them into submission with fear. She had not shouted, threatened, or demanded. She had simply smiled, a small, simple act that became greater than any weapon. At first, many did not believe the tale. How could a smile succeed where whips and power had failed? Yet the more the story was told, the more it grew. Travelers claimed to have seen it with their own eyes. The predators once feared as untamable now, waiting calmly at her side, their wild energy softened into trust. The human never called it victory. She never stood proudly to claim she had conquered the beasts. To her, there had been no battle. There had only been a choice, to treat them with kindness when others had chosen cruelty. She had offered patience when others had offered punishment. And the cubs had answered her, not with rebellion, but with loyalty. The aliens argued about what it meant. Some rulers feared it, worrying that if kindness could tame the untamable, Then their rule by fear was weaker than they had believed. Others dismissed it, calling it chance, a rare accident that could not be repeated. But in the hearts of those who had truly seen it, a seed of doubt about cruelty began to grow. If cubs bred for violence could bow to peace, then what else had they misunderstood? The cubs themselves carried the answer. They never returned to the wild storms they had been before. Even when the human stepped out of sight, they waited patiently, their eyes searching for her. When she returned, their posture softened, their breath slowed, and their bodies settled into stillness beside her. They chose her not once, but every day, again and again, proving that the bond was no accident. Stories of the moment were retold in marketplaces, in ships crossing distant stars, in quiet corners of crowded homes. The words always changed slightly, but the heart of the story remained, that no alien had tamed them, but a human's smile had. The tale became a lesson, not just about cubs or about one human, but about strength itself. Many who heard it began to see that strength was not only in control, in power, in forcing others to obey. True strength could also be found in restraint, in kindness, in the courage to meet rage with calm. The cubs, once symbols of fear, became symbols of change. Wherever the story was told, it carried with it a new way of thinking. Perhaps peace was not weakness. Perhaps compassion was not foolishness. Perhaps even the fiercest hearts could bow, not to chains, but to gentleness. The human never asked for recognition, but her name, whispered quietly, respectfully, traveled farther than she ever could. Some told the story with wonder, others with disbelief, but all carried it with them. It became more than a tale of predators and a smile. It became a reminder that the universe was not always as it seemed, and that sometimes the greatest victories were not won by force, but by peace. Years later, when the cubs had grown strong and powerful, they still walked at her side. They were no longer wild storms, but guardians, choosing their place near her without command. Children pointed in awe, asking how such fierce creatures could be so gentle. The answer was always the same, spoken softly by those who remembered. They were never conquered. They were understood. And so the story lived on. The story of one human who did what no alien could. A story that proved strength is not always in control, but in kindness. A story that showed the universe that even the fiercest heart can bow, not to fear, but to peace. It was no longer just her story. It had become a legend, remembered, retold, and carried across worlds. A reminder that sometimes the smallest acts can change everything.